Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a great pleasure to be joined here in the studio by, it's fair to say, a fairly distinguished panel of guests. I like to think that all the panelists that we have come in here to talk about one thing or another are distinguished, but this is a group that I think you're all going to find the discussion is going to be extremely interesting. We're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, or AI as it's sometimes called. Artificial intelligence is one of those subjects that seems like we're hearing more and more about all the time, and the acceleration of its arrival in our daily lives, I think, is something that, again, we'll be seeing more and more of. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Michael Cohn. First of all, he's the founder of the Vermont STEM Works. That's an apprenticeship program for high school students that's based here in Manchester. Michael, thank you very much for being with us today.
Happy to.
John Cohn is a member of the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering, and he was also a member of the State Commission on Artificial Intelligence that some of you may remember made a stop in Manchester last fall as part of a tour around the state to gather public input on artificial intelligence. It will certainly be interesting to hear more about that. And we're also pleased to have with us today Ryan Van Meter, who is an AI researcher of a company that's based in Paulet, Vermont, just up the road from here. So, gentlemen, again, thank you all very much for being with us today, carving the time out of what I know are some very busy schedules. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. So just to kind of get us started, we hear the term artificial intelligence, I guess, more and more, but when we say that, what exactly are we talking about? Because it seems like there's a lot of terminology attached to this. I've been reading things about machine learning and reinforcement learning. When we say artificial intelligence, what do we mean? Who would like to start?
Well, did you want to start with the definition that the task force put together?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's a good way.
Sure.
And I think what you kind of hinted at, and we were talking before, is that it is a broad topic, and it really depends. There is no single definition. And as part of the task force, which was it was a pleasure serving on this. One of the first things we had to do is decide, what do we mean by artificial intelligence? And we went researching, tried to figure out what is the definitive definition. And there are a million definitions, literally. And we ended up, was going to say we argued about it, but we didn't. We kept trying to improve upon it. And what we eventually decided in the report was actually that we would take somebody else's standard and just use that as a definition for the rest of the document, because if there was a kind of agreed upon standard, we chose the EU standard because there is no one in the United States has said, here is our standard. We said, well, why don't we use that and we'll move on. And we even discussed in here how difficult it was. Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
I mean, because then we can actually discuss the substance,
right.
Because there are many things that I would have said differently, but for the purpose of the report, we said that artificial intelligence, AI systems, are systems, usually software, capable of perceiving an environment through data acquisition and then processing and interpreting the derived information to take actions or imitate intelligent behavior given a specified goal. AI systems can also learn/adapt their behavior by analyzing how the environment is affected by prior actions. As a scientific discipline, AI includes several approaches and techniques, such as machine learning, of which deep learning and reinforcement learning are specific examples, machine reasoning, which includes planning, scheduling, knowledge representation, reasoning, search, and optimization, and robotics, which includes control, perception, sensors, and actuators, as well as the integration of all other techniques into cyber-physical systems. So it's a mouthful, and I think it covers many of the bases. But I'll bet anyone you ask will have a different definition. So why don't we?
Software on steroids here. Yeah. But anyway.
How would you define it?
Yeah, so I tried to define it as machines that improve performance at a task with experience.
Oh, I like that.
Right, so in the EU definition, right, they talk about learning from the environment. Right, now when we learn from the environment, that is by interacting with each other and sensing physical things in our environment. We touch the stove, it's hot, we don't touch it again because it hurts. Machines don't have that kind of physical experience, so when we're talking about the environment, we're really talking about data, right? In most cases.
It's interesting.
Right, robots do have sensors, so they're bringing in data from the environment, but their environment is essentially numbers, right? And they're improving at a particular task by trying to do that task over and over and over and looking at how well they did that task and then going back and adjusting how they do it.
What's interesting about that definition, I like your definition. I think that, the concept of learning, I think there's a lot of misperception about how broadly, learning-based AI or, dynamic learning, we think about learning like a child learns when we use that word, but a lot of things, like facial recognition, they don't learn dynamically. They learn based on some test data. So the whole degree of to what extent learning is actually happening real time, really depends. I think that was one of the problems that we had is that the definition is used to cover things, including, things that like classical optimization, linear regression, and things like that. People talk about doing classification, is that a glass? Is that a pen? And you can do that using techniques that really don't have any trappings of fancy dynamic learning, et cetera. They're just mathematical constructs. And that's one of the things we struggled with is, well, where do you draw the line? Do you draw the line to something that is actually real-time learning from its environment? If so, relatively few systems in play right now do that well.
And even within the machine learning community, we call something a machine learning system, whether it's pre-trained and then uses what it's learned from that training at a task, or whether it's continuing to learn over time. Right?
Well, what are some examples? We hear so much about this, but what are some examples of artificial intelligence that are already part of everyday life? When I hear that, I think of like Alexa. Would that be considered like artificial intelligence, or actually a driverless car? I suppose would be one. I found myself thinking, when I'm typing on the computer and I'm typoing, and a little thing comes up on my screen saying, "No, dummy, you're supposed to spell it this way," and I click on the little box. That's probably artificial intelligence too, of some sort. So we're already kind of in that world to some degree, are we not? Pretty heavily.
To some degree, we are. If we talk about Alexa, right, we're using machine learning to understand patterns of speech, right? If I say hello, the sound of that is different from Mike saying hello or John saying hello, right? So how does the machine know that's the word hello when it has different sounds, right? So we're looking at the patterns in those sounds. And then for the actions it takes, right, we might be using something like reinforcement learning, which is the machine learning we use for decision making, right? So is it best to take this action or that action? When we're talking about something like search, it's what is the information that is most useful to this individual person based on what they've told us they're looking for, which is a really interesting problem because people don't always know what they're looking for or how to articulate it.
And it's interesting, that one in particular, when you think about where it's used, anybody who uses any online search, whether it's searching web content like Google or Bing, or searching for other content, Amazon or Netflix or whatever you're trying to do, it's trying to figure out, as you said, Ryan, what the person is looking for. It's also simultaneously saying, what might that person be looking for that we can sell them? And it's very interesting because it cuts, it's doing something that's very good for you, but it's also learning about you and comparing you to other similar people and then trying to pitch you something that it thinks you want, which hopefully is for your benefit, but not necessarily, right? So it's an interesting...
It does, and I think that this is a good example where artificial intelligence, or just more broadly, computer-based intelligence, is gathering information about us individually or us as a group of people that they consider to be a cohort or just a large population. And out of all of that data, then, it's building models that it will then use to predict future behavior, whether it's behavior for that group or behavior for a subset of that group or down to the individual level. And it's that ability to take what had been the data coming in, and in the past, a computer program would have had needed that data coming in and a set of computer program rules the program then would operate with those two inputs and produce an output answer. So what really is different now with the technology has been that relationship of getting the answer that's expected and actually making that one of the inputs. And so that we would really like to find out something based on the data that's coming in, that this engine will ultimately compute the rule set that will give me the answers that I'm seeking. So it's the change, really, of expected answers, and now that's actually one of the inputs. The request of the needed answers and the data coming in are going to be what get used to produce the machine rules going out. And it's that we're now seeing as far as Alexa or our Google devices that are giving us anticipated predictive search items. You know, if you're typing in, how did it know what I was going to type? Because it has those rules already built in from previous, either my own individual writings or writings of others of the groups that I'm part of.
What's interesting about the word rules is, for many years, AI has been around. I think the first conference on AI was in 1956.
At Dartmouth College, I understand.
Dartmouth College, right, which was before I was envisioned, believe it or not. But the interesting thing about it is for many years it was explicitly a rule, right? That somebody would write a computer behavior, if this happens, then I'll do this. And the idea for many years, the prevailing idea is if I had enough of those rules, I could model any sort of behavior. Ultimately, that didn't work because it's almost impossible to anticipate all the possible combinations, and some of the rules that you would have would be contradictory. But what's interesting about the new neural net deep learning kind of stuff is that there is no one rule, right? And so why did it choose that? Or who wrote that rule? Or I've got to go correct that one misperception. It becomes a little harder, right? It's more of a diffuse thing, and I think that's a really interesting place. One of the things where we spend a lot of time.
Well, one of the things I'm sure that a lot of folks will probably think, we've seen probably since the early 1800s or since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England, when machinery began replacing human workers in factories and textile mills and whatnot, and there was a lot of opposition to that at the time, the Luddite movement, someone will remember. Using machines replacing humans and in the workforce. And even though there's parts of this that have this sort of the aura of science fiction about it to me, it's not too hard to imagine a time in the not very distant future either. We're not talking decades and centuries down the road where robots will be doing a lot of the work that right now humans do, and through that work they earn paychecks and support a lifestyle. So there are all sorts of potential ramifications, both positive and others that may be more problematic, that seem to be involved with all of this. And I wondered if we could maybe talk a little bit about that, because a couple of things that I've become aware of since the time when your commission touched down in Manchester, things like deep fakes, for instance, where videos can be altered to make somebody sound like they're saying something else. Or I think there's one case recently where Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, is in the news an awful lot nowadays, was sort of manipulated had a video of her manipulated that made her seem kind of like she had too many drinks or something like that.
Well, that was just the video slowed down. That wasn't even getting to...
That was...
But there's more to it, as we were talking about before the show, that you can adjust data in a lot of other different ways too, audio and as well. And then there's a whole facial recognition aspect that's also been much in the news about how where does this kind of stuff lead to? Is it good? Obviously, there's a part of it that makes a lot of sense. Sounds like it would be useful, good to have. But then there's another. Somewhat darker side to the whole picture. So, what could we break down? What are the potential good? Let's start with the good side of it. What positive things do we see that are coming out of this potentially that will be sort of beneficial to humankind?
I think one of the biggest one is going to be healthcare, and I think we can also kind of touch on your suggestion of how jobs are going to change. Right, so we're going to be using AI more to do better diagnoses. Mm-hmm. Right now, using AI to diagnose a patient doesn't necessarily remove the need for a doctor. It's an additional tool that the doctor has to do their job better. And for a while, we still want humans very much in the loop because even AI researchers don't always totally understand how their models are working and producing their outputs and decisions that they're making. There's a big push towards what we call explainable AI, right? Where we do understand why you've been declined for a loan or not declined for a loan. But for a while, we do need humans in the loop. I think these are tools that are going to help us do our jobs better, more than replace.
Yeah. Well, I think what you hit on is a really good, kind of a rule for progression is that you start, by augmenting something that a human does. And like, I think your medical example is really good, that just to be able to help triage, like radiologic. I just am coming back from a hackathon that I ran at MIT, and several of the projects one was looking at eardrums to try to figure out illness, and another was looking at arteriograms and trying to figure out, and again, just as you said, this would be as a preprocessor to a physician, and then she or he would have to make the eventual decision. But it would take some of it would help cue the things so that the most urgent things were seen first. And of course, even doing that, you have to be very careful. A false positive has a very different, like you look at too many versus a false negative where something comes through. So you have to think about it. But I think then over time, let's take the example of driving. So in my work, I've worked with companies that do automatic driving, and I think it's a hard multi-processal thing. You have to understand all sorts of other things about road conditions and other cars and other drivers and your own behavior, et cetera. And what actually has happened is it's progressing. We really don't think of it this way, but I don't know what cars you drive, but they're like my Prius. If I come up too fast on something, it'll brake for me. Or if you're backing in, to a parking place, it will beep. I mean, some of that is AI assisted, certainly the image recognition. And I think over time, then it starts to take more and more tasks. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was with a friend, and he had just downloaded the auto drive stuff for his Tesla, and it drove us home. And I was like, oh, so the future is kind of spread out. But I do think from a benefit standpoint, to your point, let's take autonomous driving. It is true that it's a scary thought, right? That nobody's holding the wheel, and there are going to be inevitably there will be accidents, as there already have been. On the other hand, you never get to measure all of the lives saved, right? So if you look at something, I guess it's really instructive to look at air travel, which is very different, but air travel has been highly automated over the last 3 decades, but increasing use of techniques we'd probably consider AI, a mix of something is standard control, a lot of stuff is AI, a lot of it is, ground-based information, data fusion, all of that. But, for a transatlantic flight, a friend of mine flies for Air France, and you really only have to hold on to the yoke for about 2 minutes when you're taking off for legal reasons, but the plane can actually do all of that. And you think, if you've ever been on an airplane, you don't really think about it. But if you look at air safety has just increased, right? So you never get to measure, you know about when it doesn't work, and there's inevitably, that's part of the system kind of learning to work with humans, over time. But we'll never calculate the lives saved, and inevitably this will help.
Picking up on that example, and I didn't know you were going to mention Air France, and that's what you were just saying, but it actually connects in to a point along these same lines. That handoff point between the AI and the human pilot in this case is a very critical moment of transition. Mm-hmm. And in the post-crash analysis work done on the Air France coincidentally piloted plane that had crashed over the Atlantic was specifically because the handoff was not a smooth transition between the autopilot system and what turned out to be the junior-most pilot in the cockpit and the non-captain who was sitting next to him. And so in that event of the autopilot detecting problems that no longer allowed the autopilot to work, it ungracefully handed control back to the pilots. They were flustered, and the crash report shows that they ultimately it was pilot-caused crash and loss of all the lives in the plane. So it's not that everything is always going to be safety adding, but that there need to be disciplined engineering approaches to all of these things so that human in the loop and that the transition between system and an ultimate practitioner is something that's both well thought out, well disciplined, well practiced, well tested, and well verified.
Yeah, I like this thread of human-centric AI being a really important kind of thing. And it's funny because as an engineer, I don't know what you would all say, but designing for an unpredictable machine like a human is hard, right? And it's a thing that I think that we need to really start teaching our up and coming engineers on how to predict unpredictability, or how to, in other words, don't try to outsmart the person. Trust the person. I mean, I think some of the other more recent aircraft issues, like the Boeing C-Max, are also a control system. I wouldn't call it AI. Sort of taking over and not working gracefully with a human. So I think somehow designing in for human unpredictability, whether it's warranted or not, is really an interesting thing. I never had any of that in my training. Did you?
No.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think, to Mike's point of that graceful transition back to the human, it's thinking about what is the most important information out of everything going on with this aircraft that needs to be presented to that pilot in order for them to make the best decision.
Right.
Right. And the great thing is we have very sophisticated flight simulators, right? So we can try this over and over and over and over and put them into the worst possible circumstances and see how they react. And part of what AI does is to optimize, right? So how do we optimize the best outcome in that transition, in the automatic handling of flight controls?
It's coincidentally this handoff between machine back to human operators is the same kind of cause of failure that led to the first, and I don't know if it's the only, but it was the first vehicular death that occurred, in an AI application in Arizona last year in 2019, I believe, where the machine had detected that there was either likely to be, or actually it's at a certain moment there came to be an individual in the intersection, and the vehicle proceeded ahead despite that, having thought that the human operator was alert, on task, and going to take control of the vehicle to bring it to a safe and complete stop, or at least to avoid hitting the pedestrian, which it did not, and the pedestrian was killed. And so it's a failure of imaginations in some ways for us as the engineering teams responsible for it, but these are the challenges that as a community we really need to look to the engineering organization with a set of ethics to think through all of the possible intended and unintended ways that the system can be used so that the public's interest is not compromised in the process.
This is probably a good point to introduce the trolley problem, where in designing your decision-making for an autonomous car, you run into a situation where the car can either run over, say, 13 people outside the car, or make a turn that potentially kills the driver inside the car. Right? Now, no one wants to buy a car that could potentially kill you, but from the standpoint of greater public safety, that is the best decision for the car to make. Now, if it can make another decision, great. But
what's interesting about those, so we spent a lot of time in this task force talking about those hypothetical situations, and they're real, right?
They are.
You can actually find real engineering cases. What is interesting, though, is when you actually sort of step back and you say, okay, these I'm trying to think of a way of saying this and not at all callous. For truth in advertising,
perhaps? Maybe a way of saying it?
My middle son was killed in a car accident, crossing the street. So this is very, very personal to me. And I think about those kind of, those scenarios, and I'm, even when faced with one of those, Sophie's Choice, an unworkable
decision,
situation,
yeah.
right? If you step back and you look at, no matter how horrific those things are, if you looked at the aggregate public safety, how do we, and I don't have an answer to this, but how do we, step back and say, ultimately, we need to move forward on this because it is in so much in the public good. How do we get over those ethical dilemmas? And I'm not saying that in any sort of a dismissive way. I mean, certainly there's a level of responsibility. If you didn't take it seriously, you wouldn't, it's not safe to progress. But at some point, what we have to do is kind of develop a societal will that we are going to go down this path. It's a really interesting thing because I think that if we are, I tend to be a technical optimist, though, but also a realist on some of these things. And I think that that's where education and then sort of a public commitment to, this is right and this is wrong, I think it's important that we don't let fear prevent us from innovating. It's also important that we don't let, our excitement about the technology cause us to innovate in the wrong way. And that's a thing that we really talked about a lot. And there's no easy answer.
So I agree with you there. And I think that the idea that society and technology can both evolve together at the same time so that there's maybe a new set of viewpoints that society can come to embrace that is not yet in society's hands today as technology also evolves, but the two of them can together to get to a point that they're not at today. The technology is coming whether or not we wish it to or not. Its latency has arrived. So it's beginning to be rolled out commercially and we're seeing it. We could either try to shut it down through regulation, which will not be to our benefit,
right,
or allow society to move in its evolution of what the rules, of the norms, of the expectations. And we will do that through discussion like today's event, but also through turning to elected representatives, to economic development organizations that have a role in standard setting bodies, and really turning to all of them and saying, let's move the ball further forward so that we don't deny ourselves the benefits.
And I think one thing that we talked about is, I think to the points that you both made, is that I think clarity on what our priorities, what our ethics would be, if we can work on that and then use that as kind of a sieve to say, is this a right decision or wrong? Clearly, you'll never have all of those cases there, but I think in terms of our priorities, in terms of human safety, human privacy, those kind of things, I think that's probably the best. It's a very important and a very real thing to do. It's funny because when we talked about code of ethics, people said, "Who cares?" That's nice, but it's really, really important when you start making group decisions like you both have mentioned.
What do you all think of the implications are for the future of work? I talked earlier about job displacement. Some jobs will be created. Obviously, somebody's going to have to figure out a way to manufacture and maintain these machines. At the same time, it's clear, it's pretty easy to see, they're also going to sort of eliminate other jobs. And I guess I just wondered, are there, past waves of automation have generally tended to affect like factory workers or people who work in warehouses and, for lack of a better term, blue-collar professions. It strikes me that AI has the potential for impacting what has been traditionally thought of as white-collar professions as well. Bankers or lawyers or accountants are sort of a couple of fields that come to mind where I could see, I'd rather have an impartial machine decide whether or not my loan application meets their standards than maybe somebody who, has all kinds of other things going on in their minds about whether or not, I don't know, I throw it out as an example, but I mean, one of the big challenges, I think, looking ahead is, and we saw it, I think, to some degree with the arrival of the recession back in 2008, 2009, where a lot of people were thrown out of work and a long recovery period. We're just sort of finally getting back for a lot of people now to an economic status they were at in 2007 or so. And of course, there have been a lot of political implications around all of that as well. I mean, it seems like we can go forward and make this into a very positive kind of evolution where the quality of life for a lot of people rises, or it could be so disruptive that it will create a lot of unintended problems, but that could persist for a while. And I guess I just wondered, do you think that's like an overly pessimistic scenario or one that we need to be aware of and manage? And to your point about education, sort of a follow-up thing, What is the role of the education system in preparing kids who are in school today for being able to manage their lives and their work expectations in an economy and a political system that's going to be very heavily influenced by all of this new machinery?
Strong.
That's a long question.
It is a long question.
I think we spoke to it a little bit already in terms, you mentioned the word augmentation, that these technologies are going to be augmenting professions. Accounting is a really good example, right? So accounting will increasingly be automated, where accountants will be doing less of the kind of rote numeric work that they were doing before, and instead using these AI tools to focus more on economic strategy or
and I think
how a company might use its resources.
Yeah, and I think it's that migration. We spent a lot of time in this task force looking at those kind of things, and if you look in the report, we have a section on advantages, and then we have a section on potential risks. And I particularly drove to say, well, we need a small section on future of work because it's both, right? As you sort of alluded to, that the some jobs will be augmented, right? Everything from it being an assistant, like you're saying, where it would kind of give you superpowers as an accountant or a doctor or something, or to be, you should look at starting salaries for PhD in AI right now are pretty good, So there's that growth, but as you say at the bottom, that would be our thought that that those jobs would move. And actually, we tried to do as much analytical research to try to figure out what people were actually finding, and there were several good studies on future of work and for truth in advertising. One of them comes from MIT, which part of our group, but they all tend to agree that it's actually, as you said, the sort of middle. Interestingly, as any new technology, whether it was steam engines or electricity or rail, they have the potential for displacing workers, and there's always concern. And I think if you look back, there are puts and takes, but generally, if it drives economic value, listen to me, I sound like a capitalist, but it generally, but in this case, it is different. And I think that it's the middle ground that actually, what it looks like is that AI in particular, it does change the landscape for low-end jobs to some extent, because there's more automation, and that's kind of in a more of a robotics thing. But for the most part, it's not going to change food service, food preparers or anything like that. We're a long way from affordable robotics of that sort. And we just talked about how the high-end jobs will potentially grow, but it's those middle where the data seems to show, by actually looking at the trajectories of the number of jobs in this country or in the world that have, some sort of skill content. We, like our study looks at where those are going, and it's like the middle. Some people get shifted down, some people get shifted up, but there's a bit of that's where the biggest impact will be. And to your, bringing it back to the education, I think the best thing we can do as a state is to try to get people, to get students, teachers, parents to understand what those trajectories are, so you can prepare so you don't get just left there to sort of drift. If that knowing more about how to use AI would allow you to be part of the group that's moving up, that would be great. So that, in other words, you prepare, you don't just wait for it to happen to you. So I think knowing early education on what the future of work is as it evolves, because no one really knows, right? But I think that's why reaching students to start thinking about this, and reaching teachers so that they can confidently talk about it, is one of my biggest priority in this document.
Towards that idea, to add to that, that the students, to my understanding, and I'm not an educator, I don't read all of the state and local school board education and graduation requirements extensively, but to the little bit that I've looked at them, it doesn't look to me like there's anything in any of those education requirements for graduation today specifically requiring statistics as a coursework that would be for high school graduation. In the future that I think that we're moving towards, this ability to realize there is so much data that's coming from so many sensors that all of that has to essentially be crunched down through statistics. And I think really bringing to this community of viewers kind of a vote from at least some of the panelists here that adding statistics education to the high school curriculum and making that a priority would probably be a good thing. I would go further than that, and I would also say that the state, at least to my level of limited knowledge, has no requirements whatsoever for computer science or computer programming whatsoever.
That's true.
And lacking that, and lacking any mandate on statistics, I think that our education organizations have a real opportunity for growth, and for parents who are motivated to not wait for their school board to mandate it, for parents to direct to see that their kids take computer science, computer programming, and statistics classes as part of what their pathway to graduation was going to be, would be recommended.
One thing, we spent a lot of time talking about the computer science part. I hadn't thought about the statistics, but that's a very good point. But the computer science point, one thing that we got sensitized, because it's very easy for us to come in as parents, and say, well, you Vermont teachers should be doing X, Y, or Z. But it turns out these teachers are very, very overtaxed, and they don't feel confident. They don't have the training. So I think whatever we do that would start adding computer sciences, standards to the standards that we are all measured to, we have to work. We have to figure out some way of getting them that knowledge, getting them, that sense of confidence to be able to teach it, and have to be paid to do it. It's one of these things that what I learned. I was associated with the science standards in the state of Vermont for many years, and I entered, as a kind of irate parent saying they should do this, and then I realized, oh my gosh, this is hard. So I think we need to help them figure out how to do that, and make sure that it's not just more piled on. But you're exactly right, because I think that how will people understand all of these changes, the benefits, the risks, the change in work, if the teachers don't feel confident talking about it? So we have to figure out how to enable them, and that's interesting, because it's a big budgetary issue.
Absolutely. Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I just was thinking maybe we should talk a little bit of what are the next steps, or what's coming next. John, your commission published its report. It's available on the website. I think you can go to the Agency of Commerce and Community Development's website.
You can borrow my copy.
You can download it and print it out and read it. It's quite interesting. The range of impacts I found fascinating. Agriculture. Who would have ever thought AI and agriculture have a symbiotic relationship? But there you go. And there's so many other areas too. Warfare being one of them, which is kind of a very scary one, and subject of a whole nother conversation we could easily have. But I guess what do we see coming next? Is it basically a case of, Mike, as you were saying, people just need to be more and more aware that this stuff is not only coming, it's kind of already here. But I think the next 5 to 10 years, let's say, we're going to see even more and more impacts by artificial intelligence, and we just need to kind of become aware of it and kind of figure out a plan, or what is the call to action here that should
So I think that's a great part of it. There should be an awareness that the community arrives at, that all of the places we're going, things we're doing, searches we're keying in, and so forth, is data that's being collected for the purpose of being able to get this large aggregate, like we talked about at the start of the discussion, ultimately for behavior prediction, whether it's us to the individual level or us as part of a larger aggregate. So the first call to action is realize that privacy is not private in that sense. The second part of the call to action, in my opinion, is to realize that this is essentially now, today, the effective gold rush of 1849, but in today's era of 2020. There are perhaps unlimited numbers of opportunities for economic development that could happen in this area, in our towns, that doesn't need a big manufacturing base, that doesn't need to have large capital and infusions coming in, but instead it just needs to take creative thinkers mobilizing themselves and a team of colleagues to go off and work on problems and deliver solutions to otherwise unmet present needs. So I would really encourage the viewers to really view this as an opportunity to what problems are not being solved? What am I mad about because I don't actually have a solution that solves for me? I'm going to go off and find a way to do that. And I bet there's probably a set of available technologies, public domain or available, that can be used that will be for vision determination or for processing all the data that's coming in, and find someone that you can work with in the area that can help work with your idea and help you get to an implementation on it. So those would be my two calls to action: awareness and action.
I would just reinforce the awareness. I think that education, and we actually have some specific recommendations, and interestingly, I'm now transitioning so that I can at least shepherd a couple of those myself as follow-up to try to get more awareness in schools starting in middle school. So we're trying to programmatically do that. I think we need to figure out incentives for companies like Ryan's that would thrive here, which is how does the state develop a brand that that other high tech and specifically AI, because they tend to be high wage, low resource kind of things. Though interestingly, there are resource for example, to be able to give access to the UVM supercomputer, for example, to help with machine learning if that's need be. And then I think finally it's kind of it's the word vigilance, but the idea that this is a problem that is evolving very quickly, and there is no amount of thinking right now that is going to actually predict the real future. That's a ways off. So one of the main things that we've talked about is that while this group did a lot of work to go and talk to real Vermonters about what their concerns and what their hopes were, one of the things that we're doing is creating a permanent commission that will continue to monitor these things in terms of the education kind of components, as well as the incentives, and some potentially, if down the road there's some legislation needed, not for AI per se, but for an application, for safety around autonomous cars. So that ongoing body means that people need to take, all Vermonters need to take an active role, and if they see an opportunity, they see a risk, there will be some place for them to go that has direct ear of the legislature.
Yeah, I think awareness is important. With all issues, it's our duty as a citizen to inform ourselves. So being able to understand how these technologies are affecting our lives, from things like search and recommendation algorithms that influence our perspectives and what we know about the world and how we frame those ideas, to understand how all of this is affecting us, and to think about it in terms of our own values, right? How do we feel about privacy? How do we feel about, giving up our data and how companies are using this with us, right? Companies now are using this to try and affect our behaviors and how we act in the world. It has really strong implications for our democracy, right? In terms of what information perspectives we're getting about different issues, and whether politicians and governments are using things like our fears against us to try and get us to vote in a certain way, which might not be to our benefit.
Right. Yeah. I think those things, especially as election season comes and stuff, and that we see how AI can actually unify us or divide us, and if your recommender engine only tells you stuff that you already agree with, I think that's a real threat to democracy. And those are the kind of things I'm excited by being in Vermont, because I think we're small enough that we can actually have real meaningful conversations on it. It'll be very interesting to see what we can do collectively to make this the most ethical AI state. One thing that's very interesting, surprised me, but from everything we could tell, we are the first state, even the small task force is the first time that a state actually has taken that on. Several states have initiated that since, not taking our lead. But it's just kind of interesting to me. We should try to lead there. We should try to lead with policies, et cetera, that try to mitigate these risks, maximize the benefits.
Right, and hold our representatives accountable for understanding how these technologies are affecting us. Things like potential racial bias in healthcare algorithms or law enforcement sentencing, to make sure that these algorithms are being used properly and ethically and thoughtfully.
Right.
Well, there's just so much to this subject. We could easily go on for another 45 minutes. I'm highly confident. I mean, I sort of have this feeling we just sort of scratched the surface of it. It's this fascinating subject. But I guess we're going to have to leave it at that for now. But maybe we'll have you all come back here in a few months and give us the update or whatever is going on. I'm sure there's going to be much more to come. But in the meanwhile, I want to thank Michael Cole, John Cohn, and Ryan Van Meter for being with us today and sharing some of their thinking on this really important and fascinating subject that, again, I'm highly confident you're going to be hearing more and more about as the incoming weeks, months, and years. Meanwhile, this has been GNAT's in-depth series today. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Hope you found the show informative and interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.